So it's not about doing more, it's actually about doing less for the most part and just being able to see what's unfolding, because we are a part of these self-regulating and emergent systems. And so when we are able to see what's unfolding through us and in front of us, as opposed to what are we doing into it, I find that there's a very different stance that you take to life.
Welcome to The Art of Quality in Attention, a podcast that explores the ways in which master practitioners attend to their craft. The quality of attention plays a huge role in how we perceive and experience the world. By exploring how master practitioners pay attention in the context of their work, we hope to shed light on the inner game of seeking quality in work and life. I'm your host, William Oliver. It is my pleasure to bring you this episode of The Art of Quality in Attention with our guest, Nico Michaelsen. Nico is a Danish entrepreneur who, after years of building companies, turned his attention to his own spiritual practice and to the cultivation of wisdom in the business world. He writes on Substack at Ecologies of Wisdom. And in my conversations with Nico over the last year, he's had a lot to offer on the subject of coming into alignment in our inner and outer worlds. He's been a voice of wisdom on this subject in his vulnerability in his own quest in life to bring his inner and outer worlds into alignment. And so we spoke a lot about that, about the practice, the mechanics, the pitfalls, how we know what we know, ways we can even think about knowing things, questions of how do we know what's true, questions of how do we know what we're meant to do, questions of how do we serve with integrity. These are just some of the things that we enjoyed riffing on in this episode. I had great fun, and I hope you do too. Nico, it is my great pleasure to welcome you to an episode of The Art of Quality in Attention.
Thank you for having me. It is a pleasure being here with you.
This is particularly exciting to me as the arc of your life, as much as I've been able to apprehend, experience its twists and turns. Your life experiences allows us to have a conversation about topics very dear to my heart and to the heart of this project, which really relates intimately to the quality we bring to our capacity to attend to the world. That through your life experience, we can have this conversation at multiple levels. And I'm so excited for our audience to be able to experience that. So you've got the experience. The question is, can I do justice to that? It's humbling, and I will do my best. But I wonder if we can start with the arc of your life and to look at, we're obviously going to be spending a lot of time today exploring through your lived experience how you've come to attend to the world, your experience of ways of attending to the world and what they bring to life. And I felt any context to that, as you do bridge from the experiential to the academic. You've gone through whatever the yogic path of the realm of ideas and knowledge, and you've gone through that path. You've got this somatic background or a long history, I think, of embodiment practices. What feels alive to you in the arc of your life that would help our listeners get a sense for where you've come from and where you are right now?
It's a great question. I feel like I am now in a moment of my life where I had to scour any stone that I could find, literally open it up and see what was underneath it. And you mentioned the different yogic paths, and whether it's jnana or it's guru yoga or bhakti yoga or whatever it is. Like I've kind of tried opening the doors of these various directions and pathways into the same perennial truth that sits behind those doors. And I find myself in a moment of my life now where life unfolding in front of me is the path. So, meaning the thing that's right in front of me has all of the elements of those doors and those ways of knowing. So it's almost like I've built up like a gestalt, if you will, or a way of perceiving the world that now is less forced and is more just natural, comes natural to me. There is a posture that sits, and without it, sounding like more than it is, but I'm able to be with the world as it is and see the beauty with everything that arises and passes away in any given moment. And that changes the texture of how I approach anything. And it's less sort of in my head, which it was for many years. And it is more sort of like just seeing the beauty of the dance that unfolds in front of me and witnessing it and participating in it.
Well, I'd love to add a little bit about the zeitgeist and the context here to this conversation, and what I feel personally is so valuable about your experience and your journey. And that is to say, there is a social context today in which the conversation is being blown open around the limits of the rational intellect. And its use as a way of knowing are becoming increasingly inescapable. Right? And it's opening a conversation up around the role of imagination, the role of intuition, the nature of the body as a gateway or as part of a system of somatic intelligence that connects us to intuition and imagination. And us speaking about this, I think in the context of your background, as someone who's operated and built things in the business world, and as someone that's then invested a lot of time in building up the whole conceptual architecture to understand the world and maybe put your professional experience in context, make sense of it and your years of operating and that, the experiences you had building. And now in this arc coming out the other side of the whole conceptual investigation, speaking from a place of, I feel it in the time we spent together in the last conversation we had, a joy in being in your presence and an effortlessness and you depth of effortlessness in being with you. So that context, I think, is is it very important for our listeners. And I do want to, having said all that, in maybe a more open-ended sense, what out of what I said strikes you? What feels to you particularly salient and alive here in the context of the way the struggles of our broader culture intersect with your experience and arc of your life?
Yeah, there is. I'll answer something first, and then I'll go into that. And that is an analogy I sometimes use for, and I might just be a little bit more slow than most people, but it's like some people can go into a maze and try to find the fastest way through the maze, right? Like I find myself having to go to all of the different permutations of the maze. It will take me a little bit longer, but then I can kind of like make my way through it in 1 dimension, 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions. And I think that we have collapsed the way of progress or moving forward to simply the fastest way through. as opposed to also examining what are all of the other ways of coming to a dead end and knowing what that leads you to in the terms of the greater unfolding of where you're heading. And so, I had to go through a lot of intellectualizing because I didn't fundamentally feel safe in my body. So I had to put an intellectual veneer on that allowed myself to feel safe. So that I could almost like get my rational mind out of the way and actually be present with what is. And that, I think, is a completely valid path. So that is actually not anything to say that that is invalidating going through the intellect. It is more like you can go through the intellect ultimately through to something that is much greater. And another analogy I like to use sometimes is, we could try and use a pocket calculator to figure out a quantum computer. But even if you look at it from the most reductionistic way of amount of data, there is only so much data we can parse, as opposed to the availability of data in sort of like a greater ability and capacity to sense into, which is the kind of like the field or the system that we're always a part of. So I wanted to say that just to kind of like touch a little bit on how I had gotten to where I am now. And then that touches upon where I think we find ourselves, where we have a dominant knowledge system, which is the way that we think about value and meaning at a societal and a civilizational basis. And that has been fused very much with this, if we can just grow and increase the availability of productive resources, we will be better off. And that, of course, has some logic to it, but it doesn't factor into it that there are certain limits that we can't supersede. And as we start coming up to a point where we have tried to make ourselves more propositional knowledge machines than actually fully sensing machines, which we are to a certain extent, and whether we use the word machines or beings or whatever we want to say, we're now coming up to a point where we've actually created the paperclip maximizer, and now we don't have to be the paperclip maximizer anymore.
Well, I want to jump in there and say, so you've used this term propositional knowledge machines. First of all, does it make sense for us to think of ourselves as machines? And two, if there's propositional knowledge, what other kinds of knowledge are there?
Absolutely. And that was why I had that hesitation of using the word machines, which only actually makes sense when we are in a propositional realm, if you will. Right. So I think probably listeners of this show is familiar with John Vervaeke. And John Vervaeke is one of the kind of like pioneers in this newest wave of wisdom research. Right. And of course, we have, millennia of that in other traditions, but sort of like in a Western scientific perspective, over the last 30, 40 years, we've had some really big kind of breakthroughs within that, which just highlights the same thing in a different language, and that makes it legible within this knowledge system. And so John Vervaeke has this notion of like 4 ways of knowing, where propositional is one, which is knowing about things. What are facts? What are things that you can limit into numbers? Then you have what he calls the perspectival, which is the ability to see as an other. So how can you put yourself in the perspective of something else than yourself? Almost transporting your awareness into something else, right? Then he has the procedural, which is, you can think of that as know-how, like you do something over time and you build up a know-how. So that's like the craftsman that gets really good at his or her craft. And then there is the participatory, which is knowing as the whole, right? And this is where we get into the territory of people having expanded states of awareness, these like notions of unity, like all that sort of stuff. So there's these different loci of awareness we can say that we're in, right? So if we're in the propositional knowledge loci, we're knowing about the world. We're sort of like inside pointing out. If we are in the procedural, we are moving through the world and knowing more through moving through the world and having experiences. If we are in the perspectival, we're knowing as other, where again, we're taking the awareness and putting it somewhere else in order to know as that loci. And then there is the last one, which is knowing as the whole. So what does it mean to have an embodied sense of the interconnectedness of all things and know and sense make from that? And so that is the John Vervaeke's framework for these different ways of knowing. And if we take that back to where we are kind of like societally, we have indexed a lot on the propositional knowledge and the procedural. To a certain extent, we do have, this idea that you become better at your craft over time, of course. But we've really left out much of what has been, what could be said to be in this like perspectival knowing or participatory knowing. And then when you look at other knowledge systems, they have been at the forefront of it. And one of the things that a lot of my research and a lot of my work has been about is, what does it mean to know not that one is better than the other, but knowing and having the ability to know which way of knowing is best to apply. And that's, what I've sort of like focused a lot on. And what would be a fallacy would be to, kind of like yank the pendulum so hard over to the other side, where we just need to know in participatory or perspectival ways and then leave out the propositional. That's definitely not what I think we should do. But it is more like, how do we make the cake full, as opposed to just, using one faculty. And another analogy I tend to use is the equivalent of like just training your bicep, right? You're just training your bicep and nothing else. And you end up in a point where you might have a really strong bicep, but other parts of your body have atrophied, right? And so what I think we need to get to is a point where we have more of this, like, there's this idea of like the Renaissance man or the Renaissance person that can both be artistic and rational and exploratory and expanded. And, these things of a directionality of what it means to be human. And what does it mean to deepen into the deeper experience of being alive? And that means knowing and experiencing through all of these different faculties that we have.
Is it, in your experience, fair to suggest that this notion of man and world as machine, is it fair to say that arises out of a focus or an indexing on propositional knowing?
Absolutely. It's a fish in water, right? So in even using the frame of machine, you are nested within an ontology that says that you can reduce the world into inputs and outputs, right? And, with complexity science and, other things, it's very clear that there are emergent phenomena. There are things that can't be reduced into that simplistic way of thinking about inputs and outputs, because due to feedback loops and all these other things. So with that in mind, there is a sense of the words and the language that we use that collapse us into a way of knowing. And that's, again, not necessarily bad. It's just that we then need to understand, know that is the kind of like the realm or the paradigm or the dimension in which we're talking from.
And it really is the water in which we swim. And this is why I'm, my excitement in us exploring this, in the exploring we've done of this together and the exploring of this in the present moment, is this deep felt sense that this matters so much to building and operating. I mean, it matters across every domain of life, but it's really come to take center place in my professional life in response to a need I felt to, well, this machine metaphor is the water in which we swim, and the language of inputs and outputs, it's insidious, it's unconscious. And if we're going to have any chance of building things that, we can all, for the most part, people agree, we want longevity, we want coherence, we want, take even old school American business philosophy, right? Multi-party win-win, right?
Yeah.
Right. These, some of these ideas have really been, multi-party win-win is really at the heart of sort of old school American capitalism in a sense, right? These aren't radical ideas, right?
Exactly.
But even practicing them fully, right? There's this need to attune ourselves to these possibilities of knowing that go beyond, and I want to bring in just language, and language almost functioning as a prison, right? In the sense that language as this layer that sits on top of reality, right? And when you say propositional knowledge, I think immediately about the nature of language, and I think about symbols and our capacity to manipulate symbols to act upon the world, right? And that feels like part of that journey of disentangling the machine metaphor. It's that actually, as soon as you realize that language is this layer that sits on top of a reality that includes the personal unconscious, whatever we might call the collective unconscious, whatever we might call the potential in the field. You can get into any sort of rudimentary investigation into, what's going on in physics today, and I will not succumb to the temptation to say any more than the few words I've said about that. But it seems to me that there's a field out there, and stuff arises out of the field, right? And this question of the hard problem of consciousness, right? And as it relates to cutting edge physics, it seems to be not unreasonable to suggest that there's a field out there and there's a lot of energy out there, and that occasionally it collapses into matter. And here you and I are, right? And at the same time, there seems to be, just whether it's language, whether it's propositional knowledge, and your response to that, this is so exciting to me, is it just seems to me that the absurdity of collapsing all available information into the propositional, it seems to be at the root of many of the problems we're facing, and recognizing this and expanding into these means of, ways of knowing beyond the propositional, that this work to do, which, by the way, many people do this, you don't need to explain to a bird how to fly, right? Or a bird doesn't need to be able to explain to you how it flies to fly.
Yeah, exactly.
So all of this path, I guess you and I, we exist in the world, we participate, we've built companies, and there's something of our brothers and sisters in the world that are out there building, and the hope that what we can exchange is of some broader utility. It's just this sort of radical recognition that we're going to have to get really good at other ways of knowing in order to build what we really want to build, and build beautiful things, back to just something very, universal framing of the good, the true, the beautiful. This doesn't have to get esoteric. This doesn't have to get spiritual. This is just, do we want to build things that are good, true, and beautiful? Well, to perceive those things, intuition, imagination, perspectival knowing, participatory knowing, learning by doing, all of this. And this is where, to get to a question now through all this joyful meandering, how do intuition and imagination of someone we both love, and many friends of ours have come to appreciate, is Ian McGilchrist. He talks about, in his beautiful book, The Matter with Things, talks about reason, imagination, and intuition as ways of knowing. What's the interplay between McGilchrist's work and intuition and imagination? I think we've talked reason seems to be, the reason and propositional seem to fit nicely together. How have you experienced that? How has this landed in your life, in this interplay between the work of these two great thinkers?
I mean, and it's another great question. And I think that this brings us back to this notion that ways of knowing are not separate domains. They are beats on a string, right? And so to just, I'll take us back into the practical, but to step out into the esoteric again for a second, like whether you look at the Sefirot or any of these dimensions of reality, there is a sense that it starts from participation or the participatory, and then it moves its way down into more and more density. And and then to bring it back into the field of business building, when you look at Taylorian management models, right, which again assumes the world is linear and kind of like we can build a Ford car on an assembly line, that has validity to it. The problem is just if we take that, and if we were to say those 4 dimensions of reality, if you want to call it that, or ways of knowing, and then you take them and you kind of you stack them on top of each other, there is a way where that realm where the propositional is true. So within that, it is true. The problem comes when we take that's part of the stack, and we say it's only here, right? And so the ability to translate up and down these levels of knowing or of reality is then what we should actually try and aspire to as business builders, right? Because no one, if you take them on a side conversation at a summit or whatever, and you start talking about how are you actually making decisions, everyone will say, well, there's a degree of intuition in it because you can't have perfect data, right? It doesn't exist. So how does that then translate? Because the flip side is we can't also not just be in this sort of oh, I had dreams of that we stay in that realm, right? So that's the sort of the hippification of the world, which is then the flip side where we're just in the participatory to kind of to stay in that. So coming back to Ian McGilchrist, what he is essentially arguing is not that it's whether it's left or right hemisphere. It is where does it start and who governs who, right? So there is a moment where it is right to be in the propositional or in the left hemispheric dominance, because that is the right tool for that moment and that context. But it follows from something else, right? And doing the other way around, where you're just in the left hemispheric, that leads to theocracy, right? So that leads to a place where everything is subjective. So it is ontologically transjective, to kind of stay in a Vervaeke terminology, is transjective, moving its way into the subjective, moving its way into the objective. And at each of those layers, there is a set of rules and a best way to engage with them, and knowing how to translate in between. And that is what we've gotten really, really bad at from a societal perspective, because, and if we're to use a notion of education, and with education, I don't just mean schooling and sort of institutions, I mean the way that we do knowledge transfer and the unfoldment and the deepening of the human's ability to see and parse and be with the world. And within that, we don't, again, coming back to sort of the bicep, that you've only trained the bicep, the rest of the body atrophies. So we've atrophied these other ways of knowing. And what McGilchrist essentially says is let's bring back the right balance of where are we leading from, what comes first. That doesn't mean that what comes after is wrong. It's just, it is a right order of things.
It's this analogy of the master and his emissary, the master being the rightful master, being the right hemisphere, the the emissary being the left.
Hmm.
And I can't say how much I agree that, you know, there's a propositional knowledge is beautiful when it's in service of these other domains, when it's in where while looking at the right hemisphere in McGilchrist's terminology, it is naturally embedded in the world. The subject object boundary is dissolved, right? There's a sense of experiencing the Gestalt, right? There's a
Exactly.
sense of you are in the moment and therefore can practice discernment in what you choose to manipulate and what you choose to define as separate to yourself.
Exactly.
And then it becomes possible to build beautiful things
Hmm.
in ways that are by default coherent with the system, where you can have a business that if you're, I mean, this is central to my life's work, is can you build companies that are just intrinsically aligned with the flourishing of the systems they exist in, the ecosystems they exist in, right?
Exactly.
Moment by moment. And so I want to pick up on what you said about, because let's get practical here. Like this is where this is certainly useful to me, is, you know, intuition can be a bit of a dirty word in business, right? It's seen as soft, as unreliable, as difficult to put in language, non-repeatable. And at the same time, every elite performer, every high performer, outperformer, the real sort of artists in business, if you could call it that, people with some multi-decade success stories that have not left a trail of destruction in their wake, that they'll tell you very quickly, like, a lot of what I do is intuition. A friend of the family, and someone who's taught me a lot in business, has run a large fashion conglomerate for years. And when I asked him, where does your decision making come from, he said it's really mostly intuition, without hesitating.
Yeah.
Right. And so because that intuition can mean many things. How have you come to experience intuition? How, there's certainly, plenty of academic definitions out there that we could draw on, but really when we experience these elite practitioners talking about intuition as a way of knowing and how important it's become in their capacity to operate effectively, what does that mean to you, and what does it mean for you in your own life?
So I think of intuition as the ability to just tap into a much bigger data set, right? So again, if we can talk about this in many ways. We can talk about it in esoteric ways. We can also talk about it in very kind of like mechanistic ways. So if we think of at any given moment, right, the amount of of data we are receiving, whether that is the sensation on our skin, the smells, the sounds, sights, etc., we are only, actively parsing and kind of consciously perceiving 5%, right? That we're sort of like able to hold in our awareness, right? So, and that can be trained, obviously, but like the average human being, 5%. That means 95% of the data input goes into, and again, whether you call it the subconscious, but it doesn't really matter. And the way that I think of intuition is essentially the ability to tap into that 95% of the data set to say, well, I have
that is not available through my rational intellect or my, my capacity for analytical reasoning. Is that right?
Exactly. So there's almost like an inverse thing that we're doing where we're saying, let's put all of our emphasis on the 5%, right? Which would be you could think of that as the propositional way of knowing. And then the 95% we don't pay any value to because we can't actively parse it, even though it is in the background, if you will. Because it's not that something is online and offline. It is a system that is working all the time. And so it's our definition of what conscious means that is, again, coming back to the water that we swim in. So when we're talking about conscious and unconscious, that assumes that something is not consciously parsed. But that is then saying that consciousness is the thing that we're actively perceiving, but that's actually not the case, because we are actively perceiving stuff all the time, just not with this thing that we have defined as consciousness. Does that make sense?
Well, it does. What I'm hearing is that there's all sorts of things going on, and energy's moving around and vibrating and flowing, and ultimately it's, all of this on
Totally.
some level feels like it's energy, right? And that
Mm-hmm.
there's only
Mm-hmm.
so much of that, call it energetic flow, informational flow, you could call it informational
Mm-hmm.
content arising out of the field at any given moment. The rational intellect's capacity to parse that is limited. You then have the somatic system, the body, right? And this is
The
where it
symbolic
gets more
system,
sorry.
etc. The symbolic system, and there are many systems that are online all the time. And so what we call intuition are those systems being online. It's not that they're offline. It's just our definition of online and offline, or conscious and subconscious, collapses the world into one way of knowing again.
Yeah, absolutely. And even the question there is, I think there's good ground to believe that, what is it, 95% of what's going on is not available to the rational intellect through propositional knowing, or is it 99%, or is it 99.9? Right? It
Exactly.
does. I think there's not an unreasonable case to be made that really the overwhelming majority of information in the world is really not immediately accessible or intelligible to the rational intellect, right? Which is looking to manipulate symbols and propositions, and can only handle so many inputs at the same time.
And then if you add to that the fact that what we perceive as being real, meaning what we see and kind of like consciously see, experience, when you add to that most of that is actually a projection, meaning when we are receiving a sensory input, we're actually most of the time not receiving that sensory input. We're guessing what it will be, right? So we are, if we were to say we're anything, we're actually guessing machines, right? So, because consciously perceiving things as they are take more energy, right? Like it expends more energy, like from a very like practical perspective. Um, and so what we do is we find patterns, so that over time, when I see something that's square and has legs, I'll perceive it as as a table, right? But that might not be the case. So most of the time, we're actually guessing what the world is. We're projecting out something that's not actually necessarily there. And so when you stack all of these things together, most of the time we're actually not perceiving the world as it is. We are guessing the world into being. And then that comes back into this whole notion of, then how do you kind of like sanitize and enable yourself to see the world as it is, and not guess about it in any given moment?
Or become better at guessing, and improve our faculty for guessing. And so for you in your life, as you, I feel like it's a fun time to talk about where you are right now, and the role in your experience of life of intuition, maybe imagination, or for that matter, procedural, perspectival knowing. How has that contributed to where you are today, and what you're focused on in your professional
Yeah,
life?
yeah. I think the reality, and it's not even a secret, right? But the key to all of these things are that we are already doing it. So it's not about doing more, it's actually about doing less for the most part and just being able to see what's unfolding, because we are a part of these self-regulating and emergent systems. And so when we are able to see what's unfolding through us, right? And in front of us, as opposed to what are we doing into it, I find that there's a very different stance that you take to life, because you still have to show up and there's still such a thing as will, but you are a part of a bigger will. We're all part of Will's world here. Um
And
and
part of
there's
me
a
is
there's
worried this is all in my head. Is any of this even happening?
um no, but there is a will that is unfolding, that is working. And it's almost like it's equivalent of, like, getting in a boat and moving with it downstream, as opposed to trying to figure out like how to use oars to paddle upstream, and things just become easier. And it's funny, because as I say this, there is this definitely this I think a large part of my old self would have been like, well, that's like new agey kind of stuff. And so it's more lived experience than it is something that you can propositionally talk about, because it is participatory, but it is consciously participatory. And through that, there's something that moves through you and you are witnessing it, rather than you trying to force things into being. And oftentimes in my life where I've struggled, it's because I've tried to force things into being. And that's come with a lot of pain and a lot of friction and a lot of these challenges that we find in life. And that doesn't mean that life is, just like a la-di-da kind of like walk through the forest and the breeze, but there's a different kind of like stance, that what is unfolding is, unfolding for a reason. There's no you know that you're a part of a natural unfolding system that is moving in certain directions.
Written down a couple of things you've said that I really got very excited to pick up on. And one is, even from, the most, taking just a deeply conventional view of what you're talking about, even in terms of conventional success with all its limitations, right, as socially defined, these nonlinear outcomes, or people that have experienced really unique outcomes professionally, it's very obvious that they're tapping into systemic factors, right? And there's a lot of, I think many of the great leaders that I've encountered will be very quick to talk about how much good fortune there was to be at the right place at the right time. that there's an element of,
Exactly.
in many of these cases, and just being obsessed with something at the right time and not knowing why, right? And that happening to be structurally very interesting. I think a lot of what we spend our time on when we're looking to invest and looking for industries to study, we do look for things that we would call structurally interesting, right? And what what you're sharing here, like, I can't emphasize how practical this actually is, right? In this question of attuning, like, what is already unfolding, and how can I align with that and effectively be carried by these forces? And I think you're talking about this at a level that feels very deep, right? That feels, in most contexts, it's about riding these structural waves, right? But then, and then sort of forcing your little corner and, in that within that structural wave, or forcing your way into experiences. And you're talking about another layer of working with structure, where I love what you said. Effectively, I mean, I'm sure I'm paraphrasing to some degree, but you said it's not about doing anything. It's about attuning to what is going on around us and leaning into it. On the basis then also of what you're talking about is an inner knowing. It's finding there's the environment around you and then listening, having a capacity to listen so that one can attune to what is asked of us, where I might have a certain skill set that you don't have. And so what's appropriate for you to do is going to be completely inappropriate to me and to the next person. And so to become this vessel for greater forces to move through, which seems to be a nice way to live, a nice way to be of value, to make a contribution. It seems to me you are relying to actually, for that to be at all possible, whether you can articulate it or not, you need to be connected to these other ways of knowing beyond the propositional, which seeks to act on the world, or which out of which a worldview arises that purely acts on the world. That's where there's a subject-object distinction, and it's about accumulating more power to exert will, a narrow willpower, right?
Totally. I mean, and again, you can look at it again from a mechanistic view, and that's why I'm trying to bring it back, because I referenced it in a quite sort of like abstract and a little bit esoteric principle, but you can look at it from the view of biology, right? There is this notion of like a maximum power principle, meaning that an organism seeks to use the minimum amount of input in order to generate the maximum amount of output. Right, that's like a biological law almost, right, or theory. And then when you take the world of the work of Levin, right, and you start looking at this notion of there seems to be electrical fields of form, right? There is form that exists beyond, before the form actually comes into manifestation, right? And so a lot of the work that he has done has been to say, well, what happens when a cell becomes cancerous is that it stops following the form or the blueprint of the body or the host that it is a part of, meaning it has to spend more energy to convert sugars and like other things into some sort of like energy, as opposed to the amount of input it would need to do the same thing. If it was in alignment with the blueprint and the operating principle of the body or the host that it's a part of. So whenever something, whether it's a cell or a company or a country or whatever it is, whatever the sort of like the boundary is, whenever that detaches from the, you can use the word ecology or the context that is a part of, and it seeks to kind of like go its own direction, it becomes analogous to a cancerous cell. But if it is part of the blueprint, it can use the economies of scale that comes from being a part of it. So when you start reducing it into business terms, it actually can then be more beneficial to ride a wave as opposed to trying to, I don't know what the analogy would be, create your own wave using hydroelectricity or, something like that, right? Because you're literally riding economies of scale beyond your own just like boundary of a company or a portfolio, etc.
Yeah,
because everything is nested within a broader whole.
Well, and that feels like an insight to me, that as you come to recognize that you are nested within a broader whole, you immediately realize that to flourish within that whole, you need to add value within that whole. In exchange for your attunement to the whole, you get a ton more energy flowing through your system, right? Or you're attuning yourself to these much larger forces, right? And so if you're looking to create value, you have a much larger chance of creating a ton more value through alignment with the flourishing of the system you exist in, right? And
Exactly.
again, there's, I feel like I want to move to us talking about this in even more concrete terms, because this can still, I imagine, it can still feel a little abstract, right? And I to bring it to the very deeply practical of, and it is a, there's a personal question for you here, right? Is in the story of your own life and in your own process of attunement as it's led you to the land now, and to very intimate ways, I think of relating to people and creating spaces for people to facilitate attunement within themselves and with the land. How much has your intuition played a role? How have you come into contact with it? What are practices that you've had that have helped you surrender into simplicity, given your capacity to see these broader patterns, and how fun it can be to dance in those broader patterns, and how tempting it can be when you see these patterns to think of leverage points in the system? Mm-hmm. I say this jokingly, I have similar inclinations, right, that I'm learning to work with, right, is seeing and constructing plans to find the point where the highest, leverage can be applied to transform and touch the greatest number of life, and all these wonderful impulses that often, and lead us into places where we're a little top heavy, where we're a little out of sync with the fabric of our lives and the immediate possibilities before us. Talk to me about that.
So I think it comes down to pattern recognition and being able to kind of see a trajectory where things are heading, right? So basins of attraction. There are always basins of attraction where a system or a company, again, whatever kind of like boundary use, is operating towards. And if you can see what those basins of attractions are, you can see whether it's moving towards destruction or regeneration. And you can start to see then it's less about imposing your will onto it, and more about then creating the enabling conditions for a company, for instance, to move towards a basin of attraction that could be regeneration or flourishing or whatever sort of like qualitative landing zone or direction you want to move into. And so I find that most of it is like actually listening. So this project that I just have gotten involved in, I'm just spending a lot of time listening.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, so I've been working on different things throughout the years. I started out in like creative industries, started my own like agency back in the day. Then I moved into tech startups, built those for many years, ended up building a company that scaled to 750 people, and kind of like coming into this real deep understanding of what happens when you allow a company to move in the way that it wishes to move versus you're trying to force something into it, right? And then after that, I went into more of the investing world, was in that for many years. And what I have now landed into after I went into investing and then into impact investing and then into systemic investing was this notion of like, when you have a tethering to a physical place, the basins of attraction or the basin of attraction becomes very clear. The feedback loops are very, very short, right? So you know that if you are screwing over your neighbor, he might go and, if he has the land that's like, upstream from you, he might go and put manure into your water, right? So you're always like very intimately and clearly and viscerally part of a living system, and the feedback loops from the way that you're engaging with that system is very immediate. And I think that there is one of the challenges we have is that we have this like derivative upon derivative upon derivative. So the abstraction scales up to the point where you can't actually kind of see what you're actually doing, where it's like hitting the ground. And so what I've been looking for many years was to be a part of like large land projects that had the ability to both be economic centers and regenerative centers at the same time. So the project I'm working on now is as a 800-acre estate here in Costa Rica that is both has the possibility of becoming an economic center, both for itself as a under a holding company, a portfolio of activity, but also being economic driver for the region, which will have the ability to be a biocultural regeneration center as well. And that, of course, if you help your neighbor out such that neighbor doesn't soil your waterways, you will be better off, right? And if that person takes care of their land upstream, well, the water that comes downstream is going to be better, right? So there is this real sense of interconnectedness to land projects that I find very, very invigorating. And then at the same time, I'm still doing the more sort of like top heavy work of looking at leverage points, because the challenge with where we are today is if we just all hunker down and just kind of like put our blinders on and exist in our own land. So the analogy of the neighbor, well, that neighbor is then a country or a region or whatever it might be. So we can't really do that. So in my case, I'm focused on this land project, but that land project is a part of a broader category of mixed-use real estate that I'm part of creating, or sort of like creating a category for, which is a part of a wider sense of what is, and I've written about it so people can go and read about this knowledge of like a wisdom economy. So if we come from a knowledge economy, and that knowledge economy is primarily and dominantly presupposed on propositional knowledge, then what would it look like as a question mark to have a wisdom economy that is based on all ways of knowing? Some people might call that a regenerative economy, could be the same, but it is this notion of like going from a propositional knowledge economy to a wisdom economy, and what might that look like? So for me, I find a lot of excitement and pleasure in being a part of all of those different scales of the different systems that I'm a part of.
Well, and it strikes me as powerful in that you're like, to any extent that the systemic work that you do is gonna be coherent, it's in its connection to the immediate, the tangible, the specific. It's, you often hear said like the only way to get to deep objectivity is through your own subjectivity. Right? And I find that exciting about what you're doing now, is that capacity to act as a bridge, dealing with the thick goopiness of relationality day to day, working with raw materials and land and people and relationships and the intensity of that, and then translating that into really frameworks that make whatever successes you achieve at that immediate level more accessible, where there's a flow of information that can be upstreamed to the commons. And so that's deeply exciting. What help do you guys need right now as we get into really what'll be my last question for the chat today? What do you guys need? What would you like to signal? Who do you want to chat to? What's called for here in this adventure?
I feel called to say one more thing before I answer that, if you don't mind. And it's something that sort of like, I think it was just percolating a little bit in the back, and then it's kind of like landed. You asked, what are ways of cultivating this, or what are tools? I think you asked at one point. I've thought a lot about this and I've sensed into this a lot. And the simplest framework I've been able to come up with for cultivating whole ways of being is what I've called a soul to soil framework, which essentially both honors the fact that there is a soul component, that there's an ensoulment that is happening through our lives. There's something that is wanting to be birthed through us. And whether you use sort of like a Bill Plotkin language of your unique ecological niche, or you use more Jungian, whatever terminology, seems to be a pattern that wishes to be birthed through you, right? That needs to be cultivated and expressed fully. But if we
and Nico, if
just,
I could make that super practical for there's a signature in an acorn, there's the signature of an oak tree, right? That without any psychological, framing, that there's something here of everyone has something they're uniquely good at, or at least in principle. I would subscribe to that view. I think it's a very powerful way to look at life. Whether it's true or not, I think it tends to work. Yeah, just
exactly. Totally. And that's super helpful metaphor to use that acorn principle. So there are ways of getting to know that, right? What is that thing that is inherent to your being, right? At the same time, there's a craft, right? Which is
I shouldn't be a lawyer.
Exactly.
And as much as people can relate to this, you might also know, if you don't know what you should be, probably also clear what you shouldn't be.
Exactly.
And that can be a nice path into becoming what's meant to be is learning what you're not meant to be. But
right. And that can take many forms, right? So the delivery mechanism for that ensoulment, if you will, is your craft, right? So being an investor has a set of principles, has a way of doing that, has a way of learning it, has a specific logic attached to it that can enable you to be better at that craft, right? So soul, craft, vocation. And then the last thing is soil. So what is the context and the relational context in which you find yourself, whether that is actual soil or that is relational contact for the context that you find yourself in. So the way that I think about human development, if you will, that is aligned with a greater unfolding is soul, craft, and soil. Like each of those need to be cultivated through a process in order to get to a point where you're both able to listen to the pattern or the Bayesian attraction that is like pulling you towards something. There's this notion of syntropy. Being able to become better at your craft. So this is where the propositional knowledge comes into play. Like beautiful, great, more of that. And at the same time, understanding what is the context and the soil in which this sits. So I just wanted to bring that in because that is kind of like the simplest way I've been able to think about, like, how can we get to a point where we as society can actually cultivate this in language that is inherent to our civilization and our ways of seeing things. Yeah, so I just wanted to bring that in, and then I can. I'm very happy to answer your question. Right now, we are doing a thesis, a capital allocation thesis and report for these.
You know what? Just before you do, Nico, I'm realizing I'd actually like you've opened up a little door here that I do want to honor before we get into to whatever you guys want to, or whatever is called for in service of what you're doing. And that is that, in a sense, these are what we're dealing with are also there's a very old aspects to these ideas that feels, and I do wonder, in case you may have a response to this or not, but like what it means to function. And I feel like when you say soul to soil, there's a beauty to that framing that actually takes me back to the Tao Te Ching. And it takes me to, there's a modern translation of the Tao Te Ching, or I'd say it's not quite fair to call it a translation, but an interpretation of the Tao Te Ching by a guy called John Hyder, and it's called the Tao of Leadership. And he talks about what I heard and what you said is something that he calls it the ripple effect. And I want to read what he says. because it feels so appropriate. He writes, "Do you want to be a positive influence in the world? First, get your own life in order. Ground yourself in the single principle so that your behavior is wholesome and effective. If you do that, you'll earn respect and be a powerful influence. Your behavior influences others through a ripple effect. A ripple effect works because everyone influences everyone else. Powerful people are powerful influences. If your life works, you influence your family, and I'd add your friends. If your family works, your family influences the community. If your community works, your community influences the nation. If the nation works, your nation influences the world. Remember that your influence begins with you and ripples outward." And I do feel like, where maybe there's an element to also honor how much of a, maybe a mission both of us are on, that we are, despite, I think we've gone beyond academics to advocacy here to some degree, and certainly not to paint myself as some impartial, there is a mission element to this. And I feel that today we've looked at, well, if there is something to say for this ripple effect, this framing of soul to soil, this invitation into what is the root fractal of this system, and how might it come into coherence with the whole, so that we can build more beautiful, more true, and more good. That these ways of knowing are a huge part of that, and that they've been alive in your life, and I feel, privileged to have witnessed that in what I've witnessed in your life as a commitment to holistically investigating what's real. And so I just say that to, I feel like to honor maybe some unspoken aspects of our conversation. You may or may not have a response. If you do, I would love to hear it. And if not, let's dive into what help is needed.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a response as such, other than I think that's the best any of us can do, right? It's just to aspire to truth, beauty, and goodness, right? Like those are basins of attraction, right? They are, on one hand, you can bring them into decision-making frameworks, and at the same time, they're ephemeral and they're guiding stars for they're heuristics, right? And I believe very much in leading life from heuristics, because ultimately they drive you towards a basin of attraction that you might never get to, but it is like directionally oriented towards something that is in alignment with the unfolding of life, that is in service of life. And so I find that that's the best anyone can do, and as long as we do that, we're doing our part.
The gods will handle the rest.
Exactly. There's this equation, right? Like the balance sheet of, like, there's one side of the equation which is like, we can do the strategy, we can do the things and teams and investing and none of that. And the other end of that balance sheet is like, who knows? You can show up every day, and who knows? So the only thing you can do is just show up with this orientation towards, the true, the beautiful, and the good. So with that said, what I'm really interested in at the moment is how to create categories for these mixed use spaces that falls into and is in alignment with long-term quality oriented investors. So how can real estate investment, and not just in it, and it's more than real estate investment, it is portfolio that is anchored around place, how can that be really long-term resiliently oriented, which is a big thing that I'm working on at the moment, and making that legible to institutional investors, because I can see a reality in which you create stable, kind of like dividend yield income based products that can do all of the more sort of interesting things that we talked about at the same time as being stable and grounded in a real financial reality.
Where can people find you?
I write about the high stuff and the low stuff on Ecologies of Wisdom on Substack. People can find me on LinkedIn. I am starting to be more sort of outspoken and public about this, so they'll probably hear me in some more interviews and that sort of stuff going forward. So anyway, reach out if any of this is interesting to you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to our conversation today. For more resources on the subject of quality across the domains of business, investing, psychology and art, please visit our website, theartofquality.co.